Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Carter, and here to have the privilege to introduce the final panel on Sasanian Iran and Rome. Our first speaker is Professor Albert de Jong, a professor of the study of religion at the University of Leiden. Professor de Jong has written many works, most recently finishing a small book in French on the general history of Zoroastrianism, Les quatre phases de la religion mazdéenne, and a two-volume publication on Parthian Zoroastrianism based on the academic Naklas of Professor Mary Voice. So we could not ask for a more qualified speaker to talk to us on east of the Euphrates, the contribution of the Sasanian Empire to theorizing late antiquity. Please join me in welcoming Professor de Jong.
Thank you very much, Professor Carter. It's a fate. It seems to be my eternal fate to be introduced as someone who's going to do certain things. Because I hope, even though I'm already past 50, I hope one day I will reach a stage that I can be introduced as someone who's actually accomplished something. Regardless of this, I'm extremely happy to be here, both to be here in this city and part of the group of scholars at the Getty Villa, and to be here for this particular symposium. And I must apologize for many things. The quality of the PowerPoint presentation is atrocious, and it corresponds very well to the fact that I'm still sort of making up my mind about many things, so it will be a bit rambling. Okay, here we go. So there's a passage in the Middle Persian text, commonly known as the Bundahishn, the Book of Creation, that has never ceased to puzzle me since the first time I came across it as I was working my way through the text. It is not a passage that is likely to have ever been noticed by many. It occurs in one of the chapters of the text that only those with the most burning interest in the Bundahishn are ever likely to peruse, the list of rivers. It is about the Euphrates, and it includes what looks like a small piece of Zand, so a small piece of translated Avestan, duly introduced with the words, as it is said. There then follows a line that sounds, as I said, as if it was taken from a hymn to the Euphrates River, and it says, "We worship the Euphrates full of fish, which Manuschehr dug out for the sake of his soul," and then there follow some verbs that do not give coherent meaning, but seem to suggest that Manuschehr took its waters for irrigation. Now, an Avestan hymn to the Euphrates obviously does not exist. The Avestan texts known to us are firmly rooted in eastern Iran and Central Asia, and never refer to western Iranian lands, let alone to the western border of the great Iranian empires, the Euphrates. It would be hazardous to use this fugitive line in the Bundahishn to argue that such a hymn at one time existed, but it is equally difficult to exclude that as a possibility. Anyone who takes seriously the claims inherent in almost all non-Persian evidence for Zoroastrianism, that the worship of individual named deities and the worship of deities represented in the form of cult statues once formed part of the practice of the religion all over the Zoroastrian world, anyone who takes this seriously will have to assume that the worship of these gods in their temples would have included hymns of praise and modes of address that perished with the institutions themselves. Rivers and mountains have always held a special place of affection and devotion in historical Zoroastrianism, and are known to have had their own sanctuaries and rituals in certain parts of the Zoroastrian world. But even if we let aside the possibility of a ritual setting in which the Euphrates River was the recipient of Zoroastrian devotions, the line from the Bundahishn is informative in itself, in that it presents the first king to reunite the seven climes, the avenger of Iraj, the slayer of Salm and Tur, as having dug out the Euphrates River, the river that formed the historical border between the Iranian and the non-Iranian worlds for more than a millennium. It is this function of the Euphrates River, is used as a boundary, that I want to use today as a starting point for a discussion about cultural difference. So we have had a whole program of nuance, and now it's time to establish some real borders again. Before we do that, however, it may be of interest to note that it was not just Zoroastrians who prayed to the Euphrates River. On the contrary, we find prayers to that river and similar signs of affection in the literatures of almost all religious communities of Sasanian Mesopotamia. The Manichaeans hailed the Euphrates as the king of all rivers, the Mandeans hold it in obvious affection, and Jews were also advised to say a blessing whenever they saw the Euphrates River, even though the chief passage telling them to do this, the Babylonian Talmud Brachot 59b, adds that care must be taken where the river is encountered, since the Persians has changed its course, and parts of it therefore no longer corresponded to the original river, which demanded blessings for being one of the 4 rivers of paradise. So far, I have failed to locate a similar attitude to the river in Christian literature of the period, and unless this is due to my ignorance, which is always a serious possibility, I believe this may turn out to be a meaningful fact, as I hope will become clear towards the end of my talk here today. And now for something completely unrelated. This was, but you already know this. It has become much clearer in recent years that the culture into which we are born has an immense impact on the way in which we cognize the world and ourselves. This has obviously always been intuited, but there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that even some of the most basic cognitive operations of spatial perception and of spatial orientation, for example, are culturally conditioned. So the famous Müller-Lyer illusion does not trick everyone. I mean, there are peoples, it's very rare, but there are peoples who immediately recognize that these 2 horizontal lines are of equal length, unlike me, because I even still, when I see it from it, I still refuse to believe it. Right? So the way we act obviously depends on the way we cognize, and therefore on our view of reality. So the world we live in is complex enough in its physical reality, but endlessly more complicated in the ways in which this physical reality is cognized and constrains our behavior. Now, our perception of reality is subject to processes of continuous transformation. In many cases, as we have heard already, change is occasioned by the confrontation with new things, new persons, new places, new cultures, new natural phenomena, etc. And as long as this confrontation with the unexpected is transient, we seem to have many instruments to deal with it. So we have the instruments to ignore them, to deny them, to rationalize them, to fight them, to destroy them. And it is only when all of these instruments have failed that humans seem to be willing to yield to the inevitability of changing their worldview. A large part of the history of religion can be read along lines of such a dynamic, and it is to be noted with sadness that the wish to maintain actually existing worldviews can endure over surprisingly long periods and is often accompanied by extreme violence. Now, what is true of humans in general must necessarily also be true of scholars in the humanities. We may not be as violent, may not be very violent, although some of us can be vicious, but we certainly are as susceptible to the processes I refer to just now as everyone else. I mean, I can illustrate this for students another time, but certainly if you see what students of Zoroastrianism have done with the evidence for primary burial all over the Iranian world, it is exactly this list: ignore, deny, rationalize, etc. Right? Okay. One of the lasting contributions of the American student of religion, Jonathan Z. Smith, whose recent death we are all still mourning, was his use of the concepts of domestication or familiarization. And these refer to the basic cognitive attitude hinted at earlier of facing the unknown by reducing it to the known, which is what we all do on a daily basis. So we all do this on a daily basis, and it plays a huge and mostly under-theorized role in historical scholarship. It is not difficult to illustrate this by looking at the various ways in which Zoroastrianism has been understood by those who felt compelled or invited to understand it. In historical order, this includes the ancient Greeks, those Jews, Christians, Manichaeans, and Mandeans who found themselves living in those parts of the world that were dominated by Zoroastrianism, those Arabs who destroyed the Sasanian Empire and found themselves new masters of that same Zoroastrian world, and finally, at the greatest possible distance, Western scholars who attempted and continue to attempt to understand it. Now, each of these groups domesticated Zoroastrianism in a variety of ways, but these ways are all seriously constrained by what one could refer to as the mental map on which they attempted to locate it. For the ancient Greeks, who did not have the concept of religion as we currently know it, there were two basic options that were both employed. The first, most natural one, was to frame Zoroastrianism as the ethnic religion of the Persians. That is to say, as part of a much wider package of Persian customs. This starts with Herodotus. And the other one was its almost complete sort of antithesis, and this would be a propositional representation of Zoroastrianism, making use of ways in which Greeks had begun in the 4th century to represent their schools of philosophy. So in some Greek representations we meet a system of practice, mentioning priests, sacred fires, unusual modes of sacrifice, unheard of social convention. In others we meet a system of thought, but not a single Greek author ever managed or attempted to find the connection between these two representations, and this may be due to the fact that the specific type of religion of which Zoroastrianism is the oldest example could not be located on the Greek mental map. They just didn't see it coming. And this is largely true also of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic attempts to classify Zoroastrianism. We find the same strategies of representing it as a system of practice and as a propositional whole in the tradition of doxography, but they had obviously a third option available to them, which they also use, and this was to represent Zoroastrianism as a religion similar to theirs, a prophetic religion, but in this particular case, one with a couple of fatal flaws. One of these was its stubborn rejection of the basic biblical narrative shared by all three, another the way in which it had limited or compromised the sovereignty of the supreme deity by postulating an uncreated opponent and thus representing the current state of the world as imperfect and in need of improvement. And finally, in the long development of scholarship on Zoroastrianism, the first of the non-Western religions to be taken seriously and the main gateway through which European scholars domesticated the religions of Asia as inhabiting a different conceptual space than that of idolatry or paganism, in that tradition we again meet the same embarrassment of locating Zoroastrianism on our own mental map. Scholars have debated and continue to debate the question whether Zoroastrianism is a monotheism or a polytheism or a dualism. The concept of dualism, of course, was specifically invented for Zoroastrianism in 1700. And given the situation that it does not take a major intellectual effort to argue the case for assigning Zoroastrianism to any of those classes, I can do this without any sort of practice in 2 minutes. The field of the study of Zoroastrianism and of ancient Iranian studies more generally currently seems under severe threat of losing salience, focus, and relevance. If these are the questions we are sort of obsessing about, we're not asking the right questions because they are pointless. So the question I suggested as a project for my stay at the Getty Villa, in the context of the Getty Research Institute's 2-year program on the cultural interactions between the Persian and the Greco-Roman worlds, thus has its roots, is it? Yeah, I think so, in feelings of apprehension over the state of the field of Iranian studies, and one circle removed of similar feelings of apprehension over the field of the study of late antiquity, which is generally seen, for very good reasons, as one of the greatest success stories of the humanities of the past 2 generations. And I'm not going to deny either the pioneers or the current torchbearers of late antique history recognition of their incredible achievements. That would be absurd. This is a vibrant intellectual field that has been a source of inspiration to me as long as I can remember. But it has equally been a source of frustration in the sense that the frequent claims to a novel and inclusive view of a large part of the ancient world have so often been belied by the facts. In other words, it remains difficult to this very day to see how the enormous output in the field of late antiquity can be made useful to Sasanian history, and vice versa, how the Renaissance in Sasanian studies of the last 20 years can be made sort of heard, essentially, by ancient historians working on late antiquity. The problem, I believe, is the extravagant overemphasis of Christianity among those historians who work on late antiquity. Let me illustrate this. In 1999, I'm not sure, it's not just, no, you have to listen to this. In 1999, the well-known and well-received work, Late Antiquity, A Guide to the Post-Classical World, was published with Harvard University Press. Edited by three towering intellectuals, Glenn Bowersock, Peter Brown, and Oleg Grabar, the volume explicitly and programmatically included the Sasanian Empire. This is mentioned over and over again in the introduction and is evident from a select number of headings dealing explicitly with Iranian themes. There is an entry Zoroastrianism, there is an entry Khosrow I. Beyond those headings, however, the presence of the Sasanians and of Iranian aspects more generally is almost non-existent. They make their presence known only in a small number of highly specific subfields: weapons, metals, religious communities, and in the case of religious communities, chiefly, as you would expect by now, Christianity. If you compare this to the way Islam is integrated into the guide, it's a completely different story. Islam is all over the place. And even Manichaeism is mentioned much more frequently than anything Iranian, and mentioned in a way that follows the by now predictable trend of seeing the Manichaeans as some sort of Christians, which I believe is misguided. Moving on 2 decades, in 2012, the Oxford Handbook of Late Antiquity was published, which equally promises the reader an expansive scope and even claims to represent a shift of the focus on late antiquity to the East. None of this materializes in the work, however, even though it contains much that is extremely good and inspiring. Its first major section, headed Geographies and Peoples, discusses almost all relevance. So it literally takes you on a tour through the world of late antiquity, and then it jumps from Armenia to Central Asia. Replacing a discussion where you would expect Iran or the Sasanian Empire with one of, I'm not joking, Syriac and the Syrians. And so it goes on. So Sasanian subjects deemed relevant for such a handbook are apparently restricted to their relevance to the study of Christianity. In none of the other 3 sections, and they are headed literary and philosophical cultures, law, state, and social structures, and religions and religious identity, in none of these do we find sustained efforts to this inclusive view of late antiquity. Now, there may be good reasons for all of this. I may be one of the reasons for this, because I've failed to deliver some of these chapters for some of these handbooks over a very long period, but not for this one. So there may be good reasons for this. The reasons most often given are those of a lack of sources and an unsatisfactory level of scholarly refinement caused by this lack of sources, and these are not good reasons. They are, moreover, simply untrue, or rather they are truths produced by the processes of domestication and familiarization that I mentioned a long time ago. So underlying much of this seems to be what I think of as a ghettoization of Iran, or of Zoroastrianism, or of Iranian culture in general. And this is done by removing from Iran, however defined, everything that is not Iranian, however defined in a linguistic sense, even though it has long been known that Iranianness in late antiquity was not constructed or imagined on the basis of linguistic behavior. It is done by representing, as we shall see, Zoroastrianism as a closed, inward-looking, fossilized religion that meant little to anyone with the exception of small elite groups that profited from it. And it is done by ardent attempts to join up the empire's Jews, Christians, and Manichaeans with developments that are more easily reconcilable with the general trend in the study of late antiquity by making them Western, essentially. There are strange things happening here, and I keep wondering what the background to all of this is, but it seems clear at the very least. So let's look at ourselves, that Iranists have failed to make much of an impression in recent generations, and for the field to survive, we need to shape up. And I'm most certainly part of this problem. So I will try to illustrate the problems on the basis of a debate that sparked off 2 years ago in the pages of the Jewish Quarterly Review, in a quartet of articles brought together by Simcha Gross, who is here present, on the connections between the Babylonian Talmud and the Sasanian Empire. And these connections should be obvious, right? The Sasanian Empire, Sasanian Mesopotamia to be more precise, is the primary setting of the Babylonian Talmud. But this simple truth has been surprisingly slow to be accepted. On the contrary, in spite of the great efforts of a group of dedicated Talmudists who have learned Middle Persian, who have acquainted themselves with Zoroastrianism, and who have by now produced a substantial body of literature, the dominant trend still seems to be one of shrugging off the potential relevance of Iran to an historical understanding of the Talmud. So in this particular issue of the Jewish Quarterly Review, this was eminently demonstrated by Robert Brody in a full-front attack on that whole school, in which he raised the specter of parallelomania discussed several suggestions that have been made and found all of them wanting. Now, I am not, as you will have guessed, a scholar of the Babylonian Talmud, and I have always been immensely inspired by Brody's work, especially his brilliant book on the Geonic period, which incidentally shows the same blindness to things Iranian that are so markedly present in this more recent article. For all I know, right, so his objections may be partially correct, but where he clearly falls short is in the general framework that is sketched to support his detailed observations. So we find, and you should be used to this by now, we find the usual disparaging remarks about the paucity of materials, about the difficulty of dating them, and the historical problem of claiming that evidence from a 9th century text can be adduced to claim influence on a text that was redacted several centuries earlier. But there is more. So Brody notes that he doesn't expect to find abundant evidence for the Iranian context of the Babylonian Talmud, and this is, he writes, for 2 reasons. The first is, and you see it on screen, that, and I quote, in contrast to Greco-Roman paganism, Zoroastrianism is a deterministic, dualistic religion that had no interest in co-opting members of other religions and historically did not accept converts, end of quote. And a bit further down, I quote again, it seems fair to say that Sasanian culture was much more inner-directed and less cosmopolitan than Hellenistic culture, end quote. The second argument he adduces is the modest number of Iranian loanwords in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic compared to the massive presence of Greek and Latin loanwords in rabbinic literature more generally. This he invokes to support the case that the level of acculturation to an Iranian context was much lower among the Sasanian Jews of Babylonia than it had ever been in Hellenistic Judaism. Both arguments, I would submit, are rooted in a scholarly habitus that is characterized by assumptions that are specific to the classics and to biblical studies and cannot be exported without much further deliberation to other textual worlds. Sources in this habitus are expected to be datable, referential, and capable of being historicized. Iranian sources, broadly conceived, fail to meet this test. This is not an accident of history, but it is part of a textual narrative and intellectual culture that worked completely differently, where texts are supposed to be evocative, timeless, and true, and are therefore best preserved in professional memories. I'm not sure where I am. I probably should be here. Yeah, best preserved in professional memories, where in terms of religion, the crucial technique is one of making virtually unintelligible holy texts relevant to current concerns by mediating them along lines that are not dominated by their literal meaning, a world, moreover, where even a listing of radically contradictory opinions by various specialists in thus mediating divine truths to the believers always concludes with the happy observation that there is perfect agreement among them. Right? So even when this is patently sort of not the case. So it's interesting to see that Brody accepts genuine Iranian influence in some domains of Talmudic discourse, and this is what he terms folklore. And in labeling it thus, he gives clear indications of considering it of diminished importance compared to the things that really matter, such as the law. And right now, but I need to sort of think about this a lot more, I would consider this to be a fatal misunderstanding of the way in which Babylonian Jews and Zoroastrians cognize reality. As to the deterministic, I hope I'm probably running over time, but as to, I'm almost there. As to the deterministic, inner-directed and non-cosmopolitan nature of Zoroastrianism, this is an argument that has no explanatory potential for the simple reason that it is completely false. In recent years, this has developed into a firm belief among historians of early Islam, and it has quickly grown into what I consider to be an obscenity. I have as yet no good understanding of what produced this image, but certainly one of the core aspects underpinning it seems to be an obsession with the concept of elites and the framing of elites exclusively in terms of power and of structures of oppression. But an elite is necessarily a relational concept, not a substantive one. And I came to this conclusion while working on, and more importantly, with priests, both Mandean and Zoroastrian priests. And priests are routinely sort of despised in much historical writing. They're routinely attributed elite status, but it is extremely difficult to assign this status to them when you actually work with them, precisely because their elite status is confined to a tightly circumscribed domain of reality and is virtually meaningless beyond it. And this leads to an open question, which I would like to consider, even though it scares me a little bit. And this is the question of anti-Semitism, which right now, to me, seems to be a systemic aspect of the much acclaimed cosmopolitan Hellenistic culture, which Brodie so happily claims is meaningful for a proper contextualization of Jewish texts, and to be completely absent from the Iranian world. And it shows. So whenever Jewish authors felt they were facing the choice between Rome and Persia, they always went for Persia. I think in its attempt to domesticate Babylonian Judaism in its interrelations with the supposedly cosmopolitan West, Brodie has simply thrown away the key to a proper understanding of his subject. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to come to an end. As you know, I'm still at the beginning of my stay at the Getty Villa. I'm still unsure about the direction my thinking will most likely take. The same feelings of unhappiness that I have about current thinking on the Babylonian Talmud and on the rise of Islam, I have about similar developments in the work done on Sasanian Christians, on Manichaeism, and on the Mandeans. So I'm a very unhappy man, apparently, in very fortunate circumstances. And of course, but that is what everyone expects of me. I'm very unhappy about the state of the field that I consider to be mine, which is the history of Zoroastrianism. It seems to me that we face a situation at the level of scholarship that has enabled the field of late antiquity to thrive has been reached at a terrible cost. And this is the field's inability to integrate the Roman Empire's chief rival into a vision and research strategy that allows the Sasanian Empire to be understood on its own terms. So I would like to think in the next 2 months about what the inhabitants of the empire believe the empire to be and what they believe the empire to be for. Thank you very much for your patience.